So let's bring to our lectern Ms. Bev Grant.
Hi. I'm sorry the chorus couldn't make it. It was just one by one people were dropping out. They had things to do, and I didn't have enough people to bring. So, I am a performer myself, but something interesting happened about a year ago. Going way back to the 60s, I was an activist in the movement then. I came through the women's movement. I was in a consciousness-raising group in 1967. I went on to join a group called New York Radical Women, who planned a protest at the Miss America Beauty pageant. And I was part of that. But I had also joined a group called Newsreel and another group called Liberation News Service because I was a photographer. I was just a self-taught photographer who picked up a camera around the same time as I began raising my consciousness and started shooting everything that was going on in the late 60s in New York, mostly. I did go down to Atlantic City for the protest, and I was able to shoot photographs as well as film while I was down there. And but most of the stuff is from New York. But recently, I started getting asked for some of those photos because other sisters of mine who had been in the movement had been getting calls about the Miss America Beauty pageant because this year was the 50th anniversary of the protest. And the pageant itself has become somewhat politicized in recent years. And many of us, the motivation for many of us was growing up with Miss America as the symbol of beauty, and none of us feeling like we measured up, and then understanding that it was an unfair symbol for us to have to try to, aspire to. So we went down and we did a protest that was full of fun and guerrilla theater, and I thought that I would show you some of those photographs, as well as sing you some songs. So I've got a lot of photographs, but I would like you to be able to question me if you'd like, so we can keep this informal. I think I'll start with a song that sort of talks about my background a little bit. I was raised in Portland, Oregon, and I graduated high school in 1960. And I was a little bit of a rebel in some ways back then. I moved out of my family's house and lived with my boyfriend, much to the chagrin of my dad, and ended up being sort of ostracized. But my boyfriend was a jazz musician, so I led this sort of alternative lifestyle, but I maintained the role of the housewife in addition to working to make the living so he could play. So it took me a number of years, moving first to San Francisco and then coming back, getting married to him, and moving out to New York, living a couple of years with him and leaving him for another musician, which was even worse because he was also abusive. When I got out of that around 1966, I would say, is when I began to look around at the world, and to see the anti-war movement that was going on, and to see the Black Power movement developing. And all of those things inspired me. My own learning about my own oppression helped me understand and empathize with all the other groups that were feeling oppressed by pretty much the same power structure. So we'll start with a song first. When we had moved back to Portland, my boyfriend's family, who were just lovely people, his mother had a big shower for me, and I felt so out of place. This was not my people. These were, I just felt uncomfortable, but they gave us lots of wedding gifts. And when I left I was actually left to pack them all up after when he drove across country to New York to the Big Apple to make it big, right? So I was left in Portland to pack up all the gifts and send them by truck. I came by train myself. So anyway, this is a little, I always say, like, I left him with the wedding gifts. Make it a little more guitar, but I got major seventh chords, diminished chords. I grew up in a small house, in a small town by a river. Rode my bike every day, trying to find a way to something bigger. Pushing past the boundaries of being a girl, being young, thinking I could be what I could be. My dad gave me my first guitar. I think he thought that I'd go far, but I went further than he'd ever hoped to see. Now I'm a small town girl in New York City. When I first set foot, my eyes were big and wide. Stepped off the train Penn station, I just crossed this whole damn nation. Suitcase and a guitar by my side. Well, Brooklyn was my destination. Bumps and bruises welcomed me. Still a girl not quite grown up, with a thirst to fill my cup and to be free. My boyfriend called me his old lady. We listened to Sister Sadie. I went to work while he played his saxophone. I brought home and cooked the bacon, cleaned the mess that he was making, till I finally left to make one of my own. Now I'm a small town girl in New York City. When I first set foot, my eyes were big and wide. Stepped off the train at Penn Station, I just crossed this whole damn nation. Suitcase and a guitar by my side. Well, I'm still living here in Brooklyn. My closet's full of memories. I got some space for some new ones, playing my own music when I please. My kids are grown, now I got grand ones, full of life and energy. Feel like someone who got off scot-free. I don't regret the life I had, and growing old, it's not so bad. So I keep living like I'm always gonna be a small town girl in New York City. When I first set foot, my eyes were big and wide. I still got a suitcase and a guitar by my side. So here's some photos. After I'd been in this consciousness raising group, not quite a year, we joined with other women in New York who were called together to do this protest at the Miss America Beauty Pageant, and we called ourselves New York Radical Women. And this is a picture of one of the meetings at the SCEF office, which was the Southern Conference Educational Fund, a civil rights organization, who one of these women worked as an office assistant there, and she opened up the office to our meetings. Some other women. This woman her name then was Kathy Motnick, and she co-founded a radical women's group called Red Stockings, which actually is still in existence, and she changed her name to Kathy Sarachild. And this is a smaller meeting where we were constructing a Miss America puppet to be auctioned off as the commodity that we described her as being. And this is Peggy Dobbins. And 3 other women. The one with her leg over her knee is my sister Joyce. Corrupting younger people. This was at the bus stop. We went down in chartered buses, I think maybe 1 or 2. This is Florence Kennedy, who was a prominent attorney, particularly in civil rights cases back then, and a staunch feminist. This is Kate Millett. Some of you may know who she is. I'm not sure. She was Kate Millett. She was an artist, and theory, she kind of a spokesperson of sorts. And she liberated the men's bathroom on our way down. That was... And here we are on the boardwalk. I recently did a piece, or was invited to appear on CBS Sunday News to talk about this demonstration and to show my photos. It was a couple of weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago now, I think. And they took me down to Atlantic City, and I walked around this boardwalk, or we talked about, how the garbage can there was the Freedom trash can, and that's the puppet right behind her. And here's the puppet being led around. And then she was auctioned off. Step right up, what am I offered for this piece of prime, basically meat property. In addition to taking these photos, there was another woman from newsreel down there with me, and she had the film camera. And we came back to New York and made about a 7-minute film that newsreel distributes to this day. You may have seen it in a women's studies class somewhere. People were throwing symbols of their oppression into the trash can, the Freedom trash can, bras and girdles and stockings, high heels. We led around a sheep that wore a banner, Miss America banner. Up to that point, there had been no people of color as contestants. So at the same time as we were doing this, there was an alternative pageant happening for black women. And I didn't know about it at the time. I found out about it later. And I think the following year, that was the first time that a person of color became a contestant. These were some of the hecklers. that objected to what we were doing. They were very vocal, saying things like, oh, you're just jealous because you're not beautiful, which is totally the point, you know. Only they didn't understand it that way. And I was, since I was alternative media and they weren't afraid of us yet, I was given a press pass. So we went into the pageant, a group of us. Some people bought tickets, and those people went up into the balcony, and they had a banner, which they, at a certain point, I think when Miss America was crowned, they threw it over the railing, the balcony railing. It said Women's Liberation on it. I was sitting down here. This is one of the press guys. And I had and some of us had small plastic atomizers full of Tony Home permanent liquid, which, if any of you remember back in the day, really stinks. And our mothers subjected us to having our home permanents with it, so we squirted it around the floor. But the woman next to me who had one was very nervous. She uncapped hers and squirted me, so I never got to let loose. That was the Miss America of that year, Miss Illinois, I think. And Bert Parks, we all remember, there she is, Miss. And some of the audience. So that was, of everything I've been involved with, I think that was one of the most iconic and long-lasting, symbols of the women's movement, in a sense. It was like the first time we went national, and it really, on one hand, some of us felt regret that we focused on the women in the pageant more, or we didn't focus enough. We focused on the corporate sponsors, and we focused on the ties to military and all of that stuff, but we still made fun of the women, and we certainly didn't endear them to us or raise their consciousnesses. So there was regret expressed and self-criticism given after the pageant. But I went on, as I said, probably by the end of '68, I stopped really being an active member of the women's liberation movement. I maintained my feminist consciousness, but I felt like there was a broader movement that I wanted to be part of, and being in newsreel gave me tremendous access to everything that was happening, because newsreel was considered an ally. We believed that there was no such thing as objective journalism, so we were going to be right out front with our politics. And those politics generally reflected the politics of the group that we were making a film about, unless it was something that we had come up with ourselves. But for example, I worked on a film about the Young Lords Party, which was a Puerto Rican group modeled after the Panther Party. We did films about the Panther Party where we exposed their program and demonstrated the community work that they were doing, which is really what they initially were, was a community organization, just as the Young Lords were, but it was the FBI, the government, that instigated and ramped up the rhetoric and, assassinated people, basically, or turned them against each other. But anyway, this was a anti-imperialist demonstration that started in Washington Square Park in the West Village in New York. And they marched east towards, this is actually 4th Street and 3rd Avenue, that block. And this is Flo Kennedy again in Washington Square Park as part of that demonstration. There were many groups like Dominicans and Puerto Ricans and anti-war, and you name it, it all sort of fell under this umbrella. They ended up in Union Square. These were really heady times. I mean, we really were, you know. This is a young man who was head of the Brooklyn Panther office on Nostrand Avenue. And I went there one day at their invitation and took photos of him and in front of the office. These were just passers-by. These kids were there. This was in Harlem at the Free Breakfast for Children program that the Panthers ran. Their Free Breakfast for Children programs became the model for free breakfast for children in schools. You know, they don't get credit for that much, but that's where the idea started. And it was being there, I mean, it was such a wonderful atmosphere. The kids were engaged. They were doing some political education and helping them with homework. Not the threatening image you normally associate with the Black Panther Party or Black Power, that scary thing that people get excited about. This was at a free clothing drive that they did. They and the young lords often did free clothing. And people would come. They would collect clothing first, and then people would come and sort through and pick out what they wanted. And this was at a demonstration to free the Panther 21. The Panther 21, this was back, I think this was in the late 60s. My niece's father was one of the Panther 21 who was incarcerated. So I have totally direct knowledge of who he was and who the other people were. They were charged with conspiracy to bomb department stores. Now, if there was anything further from the truth, I don't know what. It took them 2 years of being incarcerated before they were fully acquitted. And the DA said to them as a group, we're going to get you. So, you know, it was really an all-out assault on the party. This was another, that was part of the 21. People came out, you know, there was a lot of people that supported the Panthers. And this was up in New Haven in '69. Bobby Seale and Erica Huggins, who were prominent Panther leaders and at that time leaders of the New Haven Black Panther Party, they had been arrested and charged with murder, which ended in a hung jury, but again, after 2 years of being incarcerated. But I think what impresses me looking at these old photos is, you know, they talk about intersectionality now and sort of imply that it wasn't happening back then. It was happening. You know, we came out, women's liberation came out to support the Panther Party. The young lords came up and to support the Panther Party. You know, black women were carrying women's liberation signs. White women were carrying Free Bobby or Free Erica signs. It was really very spirited and exciting. This is the courthouse where people congregated in New Haven. Then in April of '68, the Poor People's Campaign, this was, Martin Luther King had called for the Poor People's Campaign. He was assassinated before it could happen, so Ralph Abernathy took over as leader, and there was a New York contingent that was organizing there, and they had a meeting up in an armory up in Harlem where they gathered to begin their march to Washington, D.C. So this is the day that they launched the march, and they're coming out of the Armory. And they congregated at the band shell in Central Park, and Columbia students were on strike at the time, and they came down in support. This is them going across, I think, I'm not sure, 116th Street possibly, and being welcomed by the community in East Harlem. I like that picture a lot. And then when they got to the band shell, Reverend Kirkpatrick, who was did a lot of freedom singing in New York and probably down south as well. And this is at Columbia during one of the second occupation at Hamilton Hall. That's Mark Rudd and the people outside. And this isn't political, but this is Coney Island, and I love this picture. And that one. You know, it's just the diversity of peoples all hanging out together, or together but apart, but still, you know, all in that space is like the thing that I think I love most about New York is you can't get away from the diversity unless you got a lot of money. And that's me with my that was at Coney Island also. That was a light meter. You didn't have cameras with light meters yet. I'm old. And this kind of sort of has a movie quality to it. Right. Right. This was a legalized abortion rally in New York City. See, these signs, they totally apply to today, what's going on. That's the thing I think that's impressed me about these photos. I haven't seen these photos in 50 years. They were sitting in, I didn't have prints, I just had negatives and contact sheets, but you can't really see a contact sheet very well. So the process of scanning them and digitizing them was tedious because there were over 2,000 negatives that I have, but it's so rewarding to see this, and it's really kind of inspired me to get active again. I mean, to feel that same spirit, that ready to fight. Motherhood is a choice every woman should make for herself. You know? Why are we going back here? You know? It's exactly the same stuff. I got a job at Time Life Fortune magazine in '69, and I was secretary in the advertising department of Fortune magazine. And the moratorium, which was the moratorium against the war in Vietnam, which was a big deal nationally, was being organized. And I was able to find a couple of people in the building, and we went up to the president's office and demanded space to have a meeting and organize people to come out for the March Against the War, fully expecting to be kicked out, but instead he said, sure, go ahead. So we organized the employees at Time Life Fortune, and they came out.
was held in this building.
Really?
Yes, Sylvia Bloom, a long-time member, had a very difficult experience herself, and I wish I remembered the date, but I guess this room was filled to overflowing.
Wow.
And I wish somebody, I'm just one of the few that remember Sylvia anymore.
Well, good for you. I was 14 when my older sister had an abortion, and it wasn't legal when she had an abortion, and I remember that. And I remember the trauma of it, and vowing to get birth control as soon as I started to have sex, which I did, but there was, just think about it. I think we all have our horror stories. But back to this is tabling in front of the Time Life building, getting people to sign petitions, buy buttons. My bosses came out. I couldn't find the photo. I have a photo of my two young executive bosses carrying Fortune employees against the war. I was very proud of that. And even the construction workers put on armbands and buttons. There was a demonstration of GIs and vets in Central Park. This was in '68. And there was draft card burning, and there was a program on again at the band shell. It's was quite a focal point or a destination for a lot of the rallies and demonstrations that happened. So these are GIs against the war. Ozzie Davis. Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman were there that day. This was the first big action that the Young Lords took. This was in '69. They had formed originally in Chicago and then started a branch in New York, and they decided to do what they called a garbage offensive, because they had known for many, and the community had complained for many years about the fact that below 96th Street on the Upper East Side, garbage was collected religiously, but north of there, where the Puerto Rican community began, El Barrio, they did not pick up the garbage at the same level. So they decided to launch this garbage offensive of simultaneously cleaning up the streets, but then blocking traffic with the garbage that they cleaned up. And this is just a series of photos I took while that was going on. One of the things that always interests me is not necessarily the action that's showing the particular thing that's happening, but I like to look at the people and get a sense of who they are. And they also did clothing drives. So this is one of them. And this young man in the beret, how many of you listen to Democracy Now? This is Juan Gonzalez. He was a hunk. He was so cute. And he was a really, well, the Young Lords were actually, they were founded in New York. In Chicago, they had been a gang, but the people that founded the New York party were middle-class Puerto Ricans who had college educations. So they came with a certain finesse or, like a certain understanding of how to get what they wanted without looking like a gang, with being militant, but stressing the humanity, the program that they developed. They took over with programs like this, the free clothing. They took over this church after asking for use of space to host community programs. The church was not being used during the week, so when they were denied use, they took it over and occupied it for, I think, a week or 10 days. I spent a lot of time there because we did a film about them, and we basically lived with them and did the dishes as well as take pictures. So. And this was one of their leaders, Denise Oliver, who also became prominent in Washington, D.C. as I think she was on public radio and became a professor. And this was during a march protesting the assassination of Fred Hampton, a Black Panther Party member who was quite charismatic and really trying to unify all of the communities by establishing a rainbow coalition. And he was assassinated in his bed, having been drugged by an informer. And they just literally came in with machine guns and shot up his bedroom with him in it. Anyway, this was a protest against that. This is me with Juan Gonzalez in the Young Lord's office. And Malcolm, I should say. And this was Felipe Luciano on the left, and Pablo Guzman, who became both of them were reporters on television in their later days. Pablo was called Yoruba then, and Ho Chi Minh is looking down on them. That's Donald Cox in the middle. He was representative of the Panther Party. They were there with a group of white folks called the Young Patriots, trying to establish a similar rainbow coalition as the one they had in Chicago. Unfortunately, these guys had no community to organize. There was not the same kind of poor white community in New York that exists in Chicago, so it kind of didn't go very far. Now, after the Miss America beauty pageant, some of us broke off and formed a group called WITCH. At the time, it was called Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell. We were basically a guerrilla theater group, who we went to Wall Street, and we went to Hex Wall Street on Halloween 1968. We dressed up like witches, and we shocked the hell out of them. They had no idea this was happening, and we were there, and we made up little incantations, Wall Street up against the Wall Street, stuff like that. And it was fun, there was fun in being part of all of this protesting. It's invigorating, it's exciting, and you can do it with humor, and or some of us can. So we then went to Chase Manhattan Bank and marched through there till we got kicked out. And then I went to Cuba. I went to Cuba as part of an alternative media delegation for the 10th anniversary of the revolution. And I was chosen ostensibly because I was interested in women's liberation. But I was chosen by the privileged white men in the group who didn't see me as a threat and saw the other two people who wanted to go more as a challenge to them. So I was set down there with absolutely no authority to do anything, even though we were distributing Cuban films. We represented them here in the States, and it was pretty mind-opening for me to realize how little voice I had and what the hell was I doing. But I had a great time, and I got to get up close. Oh, sorry, wrong way. Thousands of people in the Revolutionary Square to hear Fidel speak for about 3 hours. He gave long speeches. But his speeches were educational. He talked about the economy. He believed, and the Cubans believe in education. They believe that your strongest thing you can do to support a socialist government is to have educated people. And it kind of rings true to me when you look at the Trump followers, how little they really are educated. I mean, his mass base, he's got some folks at the top who have education, but they are just evil, in my opinion. So I got to stay there, look at films. I did look at a lot of Cuban films. Their films are incredible. And got to tour the countryside, and these are some of the photos I took while we were traveling around the country. No, but we were guided on these excursions. But when we were in Havana, which was our base, we could walk around. I was aware they had civilian who were kind of, well, it was, huh? Yeah, there were people looking out, but in some sense, it really depends on your perspective. They had been attacked by people at Guantanamo, right? Or Bay of Pigs, right? Those were U.S.-backed insurgents who attacked them. And so it only makes sense that you keep alert for that kind of thing. What are you going to do? Just say, oh yeah, you don't have to be vigilant. So I didn't have a problem with people looking at me and wondering if I was a danger to them. They didn't do anything overt, but yes, I was watched.
Bev, it's hard to know exactly when to break in with this, but we're getting a little crunched for time. In other words,
okay, then we'll go real quick. Go. This was the group coming back. We took a freighter. It took us 13 days. It was probably the best part of the trip because we got to talk with people really a lot. And these are just some random shots. That's it. So now we'll sing. There's a on your song sheet, there's a song called Somewhere to Begin. Maybe we could do that together. It's a zipper song, which means you replace one word. So the first time we'll sing, how can you sing? The second time around we'll sing, how can you dream? And the third time, how can you love? People say to me, oh, you gotta be crazy. How can you sing in times like these? Don't you read the news? Don't you know the score? How can you sing when so many people grieve? People say to me, what kind of fool believes that a song will make a difference in the end? By way of a reply, I say a fool such as I, who sees a song as somewhere to begin. A song is somewhere to begin. A search for something worth believing in. Changes are to come. There is work that must be done, and a song is somewhere to begin. People say to me, oh, you gotta be crazy. How can you dream in times like these? Don't you read the news? Don't you know the score? How can you dream when so many people grieve? People say to me, what kind of fool believes that a dream will make a difference in the end? By way of a reply, I say a fool such as I, who sees a dream as somewhere to begin. A dream is somewhere to begin. A search for something worth believing in. Changes are to come. There is work that must be done, and a dream is somewhere to begin. People say to me, oh, you gotta be crazy. How can you love in times like these? Don't you read the news? Don't you know the score? How can you love when so many people grieve? People say to me, what kind of fool believes that love will make a difference in the end? By way of a reply, I say a fool such as I, who sees love as somewhere to begin. Love is somewhere to begin. A search for something worth believing in. Changes are to come. There is work that must be done, and love is somewhere to begin. Song is somewhere to begin, and a dream is somewhere to begin. Is somewhere to begin. I think that's an appropriate song. I'll do one last song before we go. they come in here and sing?
First thing, I want to thank you for showing me the other side of the Black Panthers. I was really more of the view of them being very militant, very violent, and do you have any regrets? Would you have done things differently? When you look back at all these protests, how do you view them? Do you view it with satisfaction? Do you view it with regret? Do you feel it with antipathy?
I view it with pride. Anybody else? Yeah.
Well, I gotta say, it was like, oh my God, the nostalgia. I was going down memory lane here, because I was in New York this whole time and all these protests. Wasn't so involved in it. I was a young mother and all that sort of thing, but really paying attention. My husband at the time was a filmmaker and making a film about Martin Luther King right at the time he was assassinated, as they were preparing for the Poor People's March. So we marched up and down with children. War is not healthy for children and other living things, and with our strollers and all that during Vietnam. So this was really fun for me. I was going, oh yeah, I remember that. Yeah, I remember it all. I'm that old.
Well, I agree with Lanny. It did bring back memories. I also remember trying to measure my body, because the Miss America contest, they'd give you the measurements of the person who won, and I'd see how, well, I wasn't nearly close, but anyway. So there was that. But I wanted to ask you, these protests that we all still go to, how effective, I mean, as you said, they're energizing, they're inspiring, but how effective do you think they really are?
Well, that's hard to measure, but I think that it's good for people to see people out there protesting if they're not there themselves. I think it gives you a sense of not being alone in what you're feeling, that you have numbers. So I think that that's effective. And in some cases, it will sway the government. But I think there's a lot more we got to do right now, because this one, they're just going to get more repressive, in my opinion.